Hey Year 12, Lesson 2 in preparation for next week's seminar on the UK Cabinet, and our focus today is on the collective cabinet responsibility and also something known as the IMF crisis. Okay, so here we go. This is the core executive which we introduced in the previous video. And you can see there the Cabinet at the centre as chief executive body with the Prime Minister as the chair, first among equals. And the question has always been, how relevant is the Cabinet in modern government? Is it the central decision-making body, or is it in fact just another decision-making body amongst a whole range of different areas such as bilateral meetings, cabinet committees, cabinet office work, the Prime Minister's department and their special advisors, or even many of the decisions being made by individual departments by themselves? Today we're looking at collective cabinet responsibility, the convention that fits around how the decision-making is made. And we're aiming to get to the point where we talk about this question. Explain and analyse 3 ways in which the collective cabinet responsibility impacts on government decision making. Cabinet remains constitutionally the key body, and that convention which holds it together has an impact significantly in 3 different ways. One, a positive impact. It helps the governments create effective policy decisions. So when you're considering that, it's actually drawing all the departments together to ensure there's a level of coordination of the decisions that are made. So in areas such as COVID, that would impact upon health, transport, and the Chancellor obviously, but also maybe Home Affairs when you're talking about enforcement. And you think about Brexit, that also goes across a wide range of different departments. And therefore any decisions that are made in those areas really needs a collective decision making which is all agreed upon. And you can't have different departments going in different directions. If you look at the second point, it helps to keep the government unified. That's politically unified, because what you don't want is a situation where cabinet ministers have different opinions and were willing to express those different opinions outside cabinet. If you don't agree with the decision that's made in cabinet, according to the convention, you should resign. And therefore you need to find some examples of those ministers who've resigned because they've been against the decisions that have been made. Finally, we could say that it has less of an impact, and that's because it's not a fixed rule, it's a convention. And as we know from our uncodified constitution, it can be set aside when it's not essential. And your part of your research here is to consider the times when that has actually happened. There are 2 articles which will help you with it. First of all, this one, which is McGee and Garnett, who reflect on the role of cabinet in government, but then talk about the nature of collective decision making and the times when it's been set aside, such as in box 2, which is highlighted there, or in situations where ministers have resigned because they haven't agreed with the collective decision making, which is identified there in box 3. So that's your first piece of research. The second article to look at is by Bannister, which is then asking the question, is collective cabinet responsibility still relevant? It's a good article because it sets up what collective cabinet responsibility is at the start, but also gives you very modern examples of how the collective responsibility convention has been set aside, such as in the situations of the coalition government, but also more recently over Brexit. So what I want you to do is I want you to construct the 9-mark question using the 3 points that I've given you, to explain those 3 points, give examples, and then analyse how significant they are. And that's your job for this Sunday. So you do that in your class notebook. Okay, the second part of this lesson is about the IMF crisis. This is a crisis the Labour government faced in 1976 under the Prime Ministership of Callaghan. I actually studied this when I did A-level politics in 1990. And it's an excellent example of collective decision making. So there are certain things you need to understand before you can research this. First of all, well, what's the IMF? The IMF is the International Monetary Fund. Its role is to bring stability to the world economy, providing cooperation and financial stability when required. Which begs the question, why is it relevant to the British government in the 1970s? Well, the 2 graphs below show you why this might be the case. First of all, the inflation rate. Now normally inflation runs around 2 to 3%. If you look there, you can see in 1975 it was running at 25%, and that is the speed by which prices are increasing. For those who have done history, you'll know from Germany in the 1930s the dangers of hyperinflation and the impact that can have. And so the dangers of inflation running at 25% can be really destabilizing for the economy. If we also look at the second diagram, you can see public spending. That's the amount of money that the government is spending as a percentage of the actual size of the economy. And you can see in 1975 that public spending had increased significantly at this stage. The economy was in a fairly poor state, and the government was struggling to pay back the problems of public spending. It would have to find a way, and one way was to consider a loan from the IMF. By getting a loan, the IMF then would give, as ever with any bank, conditions about how things would be paid back. And that would include having to cut public spending, which would be a crucial political decision. Now, the political context for this situation is also very important. There's a picture of Harold Wilson. He was the man who won the election for Labour in 1974. Remember, there were two elections in 1974, which led to the Labour government coming into power with a very small majority. By 1975, we got to the situation where that majority was declining and had been lost. Wilson resigned from the position of Prime Minister at that stage, leaving a new Prime Minister to have the rest of the time in office with no majority. A tough political position. The political context of the Labour Party in 1976 is really important to understanding how the cabinet worked. We have a leadership election in 1976 which involves some very significant figures. Michael Foot, very much to the left of the Labour Party at this time, as you can see, did well in the first ballot, being the leader with 29%. But then you had the more moderate Callaghan, centre-right figure of Jenkins, a further left figure in Tony Benn, and Denis Healey, who would also be considered centre-right, all of whom wanted to have leadership of the party. It took 3 ballots, and in the end, Callaghan, the moderate, won by 56% to Foot's 44%. But I think this really shows the level of division that existed within the Labour Party at this time, between those on the centre-right and those on the left. There's clearly a comparison to be drawn here between Starmer, who you could argue to be centre-right in the modern Labour Party, and Corbyn, who would be much more in line with the views of perhaps Tony Benn and Michael Foot. This was a context in which Callaghan would then become Prime Minister, with these very figures involved in his cabinet. He had no means by which he could actually change the situation because he had no majority size. So therefore he couldn't necessarily remove people from his cabinet if he didn't agree with their particular views, without causing significant problems in the party. This was the political context in which he had to manage to try and create a situation where they can get through the economic crisis, get the IMF loan, make the right decisions in terms of public spending, and keep the government together without it collapsing under pressure. Now, to find out more about this, I'm going to send you 2 articles which will be on a PDF, which will give you the outlines of what happened, and your research is to find out about the key figures in the crisis, the economic problems, the sort of solutions that were being put forward, and how the Prime Minister managed the situation with Cabinet, the party problems that he faced, and whether his various methods that he used were successful. That's your research job. I would like you to do your notes in the class notebook here, and this will set up nicely for us to have a discussion on this particular diagram, where we look at the relevance of the Cabinet in the UK in regards to the 1976 crisis. And the different factors can influence that, such as the Prime Minister's style, the experience of the ministers, the nature of the Cabinet at the time and the circumstances that they faced, but also the majority size that any Prime Minister has. So what I want you to do is to consider this, and if you come up with your ideas ready for the seminar next week, you can put them on the notebook here. But we'll certainly look to clarify that next week. Okay, there's your work set up. Good luck.